Lord of the Rings is a best-selling novel of the 20th century, the blueprint for heroic fantasy, greatest movie trilogy of all time. If you give it a bit of a budget and some talent, you have absolute gold for every artistic medium, provided it has just a touch of care and authenticity. Which makes it far more miraculous that nobody seems to want to do this franchise any form of justice. Tales of the Shire is shallow, modern audience, AI-adjacent slop. Manufactured by a studio with hundreds of employees, it's effectively Animal Crossing, with no content and a popular IP reskin. Like a mobile game, forgettable and inoffensive, cynical cash-in. By itself, not a problem. But in the big picture, this is emblematic of how the entire franchise has been treated for decades. We deserve better than it being gruesomely defiled again and again like it's the corpse in the hands of the loathsome dung-eater. There was a time when a full story could be told without a word. Think of when the Fellowship reaches Eloris in Rohan. They already had met the famed riders of Rohan, exiled. What sort of kingdom would do that to their own loyal good men? As they pull up, before they have met anyone or talked to the king, they see a downtrodden faces, are met with silence and fatigue. The audience hears sorrowful music with a touch of nobility, and we see one of the most iconic shots, one with beautiful imagery that Tolkien would surely have appreciated. One of the banners snaps free, floating with the wind before being unceremoniously dumped right before Aragorn. This is an empire in complete decline. In context, we understand already how much reverence Aragorn has for the history in his respect for Narsil, Sword of Isildur, when they came across Argonath, the Pillars of the Kings, while traveling by river. When tradition and history is not held in reverence, the people suffer. A weak king creates weak people, weak leaders, disregard for history. Seems like a perfect way to describe the grave robbers despoiling Tolkien's work at every opportunity, doesn't it? Tolkien would spend an entire page describing small details in the scenery of every location, so you would understand precisely what he wanted you to see. The Fellowship would encounter ruins, statues, natural areas, and he would describe its history because to him, the history and the lore inside the world mattered. The world building was so valuable to him, he invented languages. Some of these lengthy descriptions would have zero bearing on the immediate storytelling. It would not be used to set up some plot point or solve some puzzle or battle. If you missed it, your understanding of the basic story would not be hampered. This is something that is missing from almost all modern storytelling. How many times have you watched a movie and it focuses on some piece of backdrop? Or there is some cryptic sounding bit of dialogue and you immediately know, this is going to be important later. Or maybe even in this very scene. This is going to be used as a part of conclusion to some sort of scene or subplot. That is not to say setting up or foreshadowing something is a bad thing, though a lack of misdirection has made this far too predictable as of late. But it showcases one of the reasons nobody can handle decades-old franchises, especially in sci-fi and fantasy, which were built with extensive world building with great intent. Most modern corporate writers, making Netflix shows or writing for AAA games, have zero attention for detail. To turn it into a movie or video game is to turn 1,000 words into a picture. If we were to show 1,000 different shots from the Lord of the Rings trilogy, we get struck to hell and back. But that aside, each would come with a context between good and evil, heroism and villainy. Each carries emotion, builds the personality of the characters, and the beauty of the world that must be protected. The Lord of the Rings is one of the masterpieces of history. On the same level of the Greek classics and plays of Shakespeare, it is a Herculean labor to do it full justice. So it seems rather than trying to do it justice, game developers and showrunners today only want to trample on his legacy. The last 3 major Lord of the Rings products have been Rings of Power, Gollum, and now Tales of the Shire. If that doesn't tell you how much corporations hate money, nothing will. Alright, we did forget one there, the Lord of the Rings Magic card set, which was one of their best-selling promotions up until the recent Final Fantasy card set, proving, just like with Final Fantasy, there is still overwhelming interest in the Lord of the Rings. There's still a massive audience for this, so there is no excuse for these games to be competing in numbers with indie asset flips, and often still losing. So what is going wrong? The games industry is full of people who hate games, hate gamers, and have spite for everything that in the 90s, these same people mocked as nerd culture. And their goal, since the early 2010s, was to take over and then deliberately ruin and desecrate every major nerd culture franchise. Comic books are a mess, despite manga selling better than ever, so never let them sell you some lie about people not reading or being able to buy books anymore. Manga are not exactly cheap. Star Wars and Trek, both in shambles. They can't sell movies, shows, merch, despite these being merch powerhouses for over half a century. Disney botching Star Wars because they wanted to turn it into a girl brand would be like McDonald's buying KFC, then trying to turn it into a vegan food chain. D&D is in heavy decline despite a lockdown boost, largely due to the greed of the OGL scandal, which trampled on creatives that were acting like modders do for Skyrim. Now, Gollum could be brushed off as poorly advised, cheap swill, made by people with no clue what they were doing, like your average movie game or LJN title. It's still no way to treat Tolkien, and again, just like Tales of the Shire, if it were just one standout title instead of being the norm, it would go under the radar. Rings of Power. We're gonna blast this one out in one breath, one take, unedited. Could have been this generation's Game of Thrones in the right hands, bringing to life the far less mainstream stories from the Silmarillion, created by one of the most wealthiest corporations on the planet, with billions spent between rights, production, and promotion. They paid influencers to pretend to be Tolkien fans and praise it. By the way, months after the show launched, most of these so-called super fans who pretended to be eagerly awaiting the show hadn't even watched it. They had a promo cycle full of the obnoxious, hate-mongering baiting, where they go over why Tolkien's work was problematic, why it needed to be fixed by the smarter writers at Amazon, putting a heavy focus on Galadriel Girlboss, and the first Black Dwarf of female color in a Middle-earth production which will redress the balance, and blah blah blah. First gay elf of color with the 2024 fade. Big shock. Must have been hard to not go the Yasuke route and have hip-hop play every time he's on screen or put him in chains. Except for that one part where they did put him in chains. They openly belittled scholars and long-term fans of fantasy, while praising how stunning and brave the main characters who look nothing like the meticulous description of Tolkien are. And to the surprise of nobody, we soon found the lack of care for the visual depictions was exponentially amplified when it came to their disdain for the personalities. Pause. The elves were petulant children. They look like average persons of California. They have none of that otherworldly grace or noble beauty. In the Lords of the Rings trilogy, you could tell the elves were meant to be awe-inspiring. A prime example is in the Battle of Helm's Deep, where the row of elves march and shoot arrows in perfect unison, have similar looks and discipline, wear perfect matching armor. They sharply contrast the humans, which show fear, have mismatched armor and weapons. Each look different. They lack the same control and poise as shown. By the first to let an arrow loose, they have old men and children alike on the battlements. They are not holding their weapons the same. Some are grimy or missing an eye. Perhaps not unlike the fearful boys that were marched in and killing fields during the Great War. This was done with purpose. This contrast has meaning to the movies and has meaning in the books. When Tolkien writes about the varied races of Middle-earth, last, the orcs. Their armor is factory produced, also matches, while the elven armor is likely centuries old but carefully maintained. The orc armor was manufactured mere days before the march and already looks like it has been through hell. Coated in filth, again, this is a story that is told at a glance. This builds up two groups without words between them. The elves stand silent and ready. The orcs breathe heavily like livestock, pounding the ground to inflict terror. And as the first arrow is loosed, after a pause, they squeal and screech in anger. In Rings of Power, the orcs are downtrodden refugees with children just trying to survive. The writers were never interested in ever portraying orcs as Tolkien intended, as they are in actual Middle-earth. They use orcs like they use everything, as a vessel for current socio-political preaching. There is a tendency for people who cannot create their own stories to leech off the franchises that others have made, but with a spite and arrogance to think they can do better, improve it. Evil is not able to create anything new. It can only distort and destroy what has been invented or made by the forces of good. The twisting of the beauty of the elves by Morgoth into the evil, destructive orcs is a perfect encapsulation of what modern caretakers have done with long-loved nerd franchises. Tolkien made his stories in a very specific way, and his novels became some of the best-selling books ever made for a reason. Fans love those books for those details, world-building, and heroism. When people who hate that world, who hate heroism, who hate world-building, who do not even want to create using the blueprint, take over, they will always ruin it. And this has been proven, without fail, franchise after franchise, for the last 15 years. Corporations, IP owners, you have paid quite a bit of money for these money-printing franchises. If you're going to buy the rights to something famous, its value is in what it is as an IP and the fans it comes packaged with. If you have a rudimentary knowledge of business, you likely understand the value of client lists, of customer loyalty, and you may have heard of something called the customer acquisition cost. This is what businesses expect to have to pay to earn new customer. This is extremely important. So it makes it all the more baffling that they paid billions to acquire millions of customers, only to call those very customers toxic, misogynist, problematic, to not only alter the fundamentals of the product itself, to make it unappealing to the already earned customer base, but to do so while openly attacking, insulting, and driving away people who have been spending on monies, shows, games, and toys, and more for decades. When you alienate and attack the fans, you lose half your fans who are there for the fan base. When you change what makes the IP what it is, you lose the other half who is there for the world. You keep buying everything up and ruining it, and now you have nothing left to buy. Just a bunch of heavily depleted IPs that the original fans of are not going to be getting their children into. You have broken the generational chain. For the likes of Star Trek and Doctor Who, that's 4 generations of getting their kids into it. They coast, briefly, off the IP someone else made for them, because if they were to create their own things, well, we've seen what they can create. It's called Forspoken and Concord. Evil is not going to be able to create anything new. It can only distort and destroy what has been invented or made by the forces of good. Disney's Star Wars took home $2 billion with The Force Awakens, purely based on name and what others had built. What did their creation earn them? By the time they reached Rise of Skywalker, a mere 2 movies later, they made $1 billion. They cut their audience in half because they took a massive crap on the fan base they already had in an attempt to appeal to a bunch of piss-stained Karens who never had any interest in it beyond being able to scream on Twitter how the change was a win for them, that this was fixing the franchises that appealed to men by making them unappealing to men, so the media cult could berate and lash out at people for daring to not like the corporate swill. Tales of the Shire is a cheap-looking, bare-bones and dull, uninteresting slop art style. Timu, we have The Hobbit at home. The target is female gamers, but they couldn't even really gain that. There's a million life simulators that do this better out there. Its sole single potential hook being the IP, and it's poorly utilized, with generic graphics, no recognizable style, and a lack of anything interesting in the character or landscape design. Which for a game about the Shire, one would think, if anything could be done well, it would be the visuals. But if you have played or watched a single modern audience product, you are well aware that visuals are not what they consider to be an important part of art. Is anyone tired of being told you should not notice or critique when a story deliberately takes steps to not look like or resemble the creator's vision? That we're supposed to act like the visual part of an audio-visual medium is not important? Lord of the Rings Online is almost 20 years old and has a million times more charm in the world design of the Hobbit areas, and that was an MMORPG with a full world to create. It could not just focus on a single area. There's thousands of zones, dungeons, instances, caves, and towns. Putting the two side by side is genuinely shocking how much more passion and care was in every single aspect of this game designed 2 decades ago. The games media wants to call gamers toxic and too angry over noticing what they've done to ruin video games and fantasy. I disagree. Gamers are not nearly angry enough. Yet. Dungeons and Dragons, Lord of the Rings, Warhammer bring you into a world. That world has its own lore, characters, nations, cultures, world building. People who become fans of these things want immersion in that world, want to be brought into the lives and struggles detailed in the book, feel like they are in command of great fantasy armies, and explore dungeons as a budding hero. Immersion in a world that is not like our own. Never feel shame or guilt for this. You are allowed to want escapism. You're not in the wrong, they are. The modern audience writers that have ruined these worlds want a game that reflects their narrow reality, that tackles their daily struggles with an extremely narrow, ignorant lifestyle of luxury where microaggressions are the biggest worries they will ever have to deal with, so you will never be able to relate to them. This is therapy for personal traumas of grotesquely spoiled Karens. There are plenty of genres out there that do exactly what they want. Games and television alike are brimming with shallow dramas and narrative walking simulators, yet they pick the one genre that does not. Went into franchises that do not, and relied on corporate power to take over the creative works of others at AAA studios, while using censorship pressure to silence any and all dissent to the regime through corporate social media Goliaths. Every game must affirm their personal reality. While fans of fantasy wanted not every game, but just this one genre that for so long was reviled by average people to provide them an escape. You can make some things that have broad appeal, but an escape from reality is diametrically opposed to a simulation of it. This was never going to work out, not at the writing skill level of people who can only coast off someone else's creation. You will notice how there is effectively zero major original fantasy from these people. The closest you'll ever get is something like a Twilight, which is a dark romance fetish story with a hint of fantasy thrown in for flavor, like a sprinkling of salt. They have a depth of storytelling that is on par with Help, Stepbrother, I'm Stuck in the Washer. Rings of Power is romance fetish bait. It's for femcels to goon over. Galadriel x Sauron, Isildur x Estrid, Arondir x Bronwyn. We could go on. There's 10 different horrible romances in that show, 0 of which would have ever been part of a Lord of the Rings book, none of which have some deep purpose or meaning. On the other hand, the Aragorn-Arwen relationship reinforces the themes of Lord of the Rings. It directly relates to the story he was telling because he knew what he was doing. Sacrifice, duty, the beauty of love in the human world, the fleeting old world, which includes the good of the elves and the evil of Sauron. They both have to make choices. They face conflict regarding their lifespans over the difference in their worlds, in him being a human ranger and then human king, and her being a long-lived elf. Tradition, a people in decline, themes that are repeated 1,000 times over in his story because that is the story he wanted to tell. But it is a story that the current custodians have zero interest in, zero understanding of, and very clearly, zero capacity to use the meticulous blueprint he left behind even if they wanted to. Arwen reminds Aragorn what he values, why he must stop Sauron, why Middle-earth is worth fighting for, in the same way Gondor is for Boromir and the Shire is for the hobbits. Why did Galadriel end up in a weird relationship with Sauron in Rings of Power? She spent all that time hunting long past anyone else would, with the threat he bears, with her keeping secrets from her allies, and forging rings just as he wanted, with her being the reason he manages to take power ultimately? Does it have some brilliant literary reasoning? Is there some overarching motivation? No. It's because the writers of the show goon to this. Because this is their fetish fan fiction. And that is solely the reason they do anything. They want a relationship in the show because they like it. They want a subplot that lets them feel seen. They want to swap a character because it signals they have virtue. And they want to show the villain to be just like the person they hate in real life. It's pure indulgence. They want. Tales of the Shire, Rings of Power, Gollum. If they don't wake up, this is going to be the next 10, 20, 30 years of desecration. And if you're not convinced yet how little they respect Tolkien, the shit cherry on top is this is yet another SBI consulting job. Yes, that SBI. The one that ruins all the games. The consultants who were just caught admitting they proudly plagiarize all their work, which really is not a surprise and perhaps fitting. It works perfectly for these people. No wonder it looks like AI. It's all about stealing from other artists. Gollum, perhaps we judged you too harshly. At least you were unique. In the sense that nobody could ever replicate what you gave the world, at least influencers found a way to turn you into something kind of entertaining for a while. Thank you, Gollum. Turns out the real precious was the friends we made along the way. But you know who will never bite off your finger and jump into a pool of lava? Like, comment, and subscribe for more lamentation on what we have lost, and hope for a future where we have learned a lesson or two about letting hobgoblins raise our precious franchises to the ground. And if I have angered the tens of people who played this game, I apologize for absolutely nothing. Now, if there is one big funny, it's that they didn't include any romance in the game because they weren't smart enough to program it. Because you know if they could, this would be a dating sim. Everything they make is. Actually, come back to it, what was the fake reason they gave? Oh, right. Because romance is not what hobbits are about. How exactly do these hobbits all have some of the biggest families in the franchise? Do they just spring out of holes in the ground?